to Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Swin Dobson, and him, Tim Matt. Today we discuss time, clock changes, and industrialization. Tim.
There was a book which I read on Kindle Unlimited. It's a sort of conspiracy theory Uber-esque book, and I'm not criticizing the word conspiracy, by the way. And one of the interesting pieces of this book's evidence was, and the book made the argument that we humans aren't from Earth. It's like an alien book. And one of the pieces of evidence, and that's very relevant to this conversation we're about to have, is that clocks that are quote-unquote internal biological clocks, and more or less quote-unquote scientists have proved this, are more like 25 to 26 hours. Now, whether you think this theory is true, that humans aren't from Earth because our biological clocks are more like 25 to 26 hours, if not even longer, because they've done cave studies, that's another piece of evidence brought up, and people can adjust to like 48-hour sleep cycles. If you have no natural light, you can just turn the lights on every when you want. You like pretend you have your quote-unquote day. People will sleep like 15 hours and be awake for whatever, 20 hours, and then or 30 hours, and so forth. So like the 24-hour day itself is a thing that people aren't always attuned to it, and they're actually a way of sleep shifting for if you have a problem of getting up early. Rather than getting up earlier, you get up later, and eventually. So like one day you'll get up at noon, next day you'll get up at 4, next day you'll get up at 8, 12, and then 4 a.m. if you want to. Again, I'm not saying, but there's just ways to think about this. And in Richard Pipes' Russia Under the Old Regime, which is a great book, everyone should read it, Pipes makes the point that peasants, and this is in northern Russia, in parts of Russia, well, Russia is very north anyway, during the long northern summers at harvest time, they worked basically dawn to dusk. During the winter, it was the opposite. So for them, a work day in the summer when harvest was happening was like 20 hours. In winter, it was next to nothing. So hence time as a thing with 60 seconds and 60 minutes and 24-hour days and 365-day years, 365 and 1/4 day years is an invention somewhat of industrialization, but definitely civilization. If you look into like cross-cultural anthropology over calendar lengths, for example, Mesopotamia, get my ancient civilization. Yeah, Mesopotamia has 360-day calendar. They invented that because it was easier procedurally. 120. This goes back to the Herbert Spencer, the metric versus imperial. It was an easy number to divide. But they sort of knew many civilizations also had a 354-day year, and that's based on the solar months and the solar year. But the 360 was easy to divide up. You know, you could have so forth. And I'm saying all this about time because days are part of time. It's just to like quote unquote relativize and put some context here over what like time is. So I would argue that clock time is a construction of industrialization, in particularly railroads. The railroads is the thing that invented time zones and centralized time. So in a few weeks here in the United States, in many places other, it might have happened. Every year, twice, I have to listen to people moan and whine about clock changes. Even though, by the way, hardly anyone owns cows or milks cows or do things like that. These are things that are presented well. The cows don't believe in the clock change. This. And it's like, do you actually own cows? And people say, oh, their babies now are going to sleep on a slightly different nap schedule, even though things like that. And I, for one, like or am indifferent, or if anything, supportive of quote unquote what it's called summertime, which could be colloquially called summertime, because for the reasons of social activities, many people are night owls. I'm a night owl to a large extent. And even if I'm not a night owl, the night, you can just get up earlier and it's dark. So I like the current existing system. It's a very much of a 3/5 compromise thing, because to me, I see the debate as night owls versus morning owls. Calendars and time clocks, to me, are social constructions. And my point about the 360 versus 365 versus 365 and a quarter is to say that like the time to some extent is quote unquote invented in that sense. So back to the time things. There's interesting quirks about this. Spain, thanks to everyone's friend, everyone's favorite dictator's friend, is on EU time. So that means Spain, Western Spain in particular, there's a photo of the beach here I brought up. And this is at 7 p.m. But if I would ask someone, guess what quote unquote time it is based on the natural circumstances, and this is not in like the northern hemisphere, so you can't do that point. It's like 7 p.m. and actually you have very late sunsets, and some people like this fact. It's part of they'll make the argument that it's quote unquote Spanish culture that you can be out late like that. So what is wrong with liking long evenings? I mean, why not choose when you want to have the time? And by the way, you can in theory stay at noon, midday, if you match the speed. This goes back to like what shape you think the Earth is, but like there are planes that can do this. You can sort of do this. You can do this somewhat on northern flights. You can follow the sun. So in that sense, if you're following the quote unquote natural time, which is what a lot of quote unquote advocates of standard time will try to make, I think it's a very lame defense, because why not use time to suit our needs? Which brings me to my first broad question here. How ought a society organize its days and time? Please don't say naturally. I mean, because if you say naturally, will you work 18 hours a day in the summer and 6 hours days in the winter because that is natural? That to some extent is unnatural. And also, as time zones itself, like in the western edge of a time zone and eastern edge of the time zone, with a big time zone like the central time zone, or even the eastern time zone in the United States. I mean, Britain has a unique situation because it's relatively narrow and long, so the time makes sense. But like, if you have a civilization that's the opposite, that's 500 miles wide and 100 miles north to south, you have a problem. Even if you stick to the quote, you have to the western edge and the eastern edge would have, like if you had the same, the western edge and eastern edge will have the difference. So like if they do change it and I headed to, let's say, eastern Indiana, I could get a very late sunset, even if you had quote unquote standard time. And if I headed to Maine in the eastern time zone, I could get a very early sunrise, even if you centralized it around, let's say, New York City or somewhere place in the middle. So again, like clock time to some extent is an invention of modernity, and as those calendars as well. So questions with him. You're a critic of the clock changes, and I can see why. But I would also just say more broadly, we do all sorts of weird things like that, like leap year and things like that. This is completely normal for civilization. What would you make of the question of how society organizes days and times? Why don't you like this system, or why are you more angry at it? Swithin, thanks for doing this episode.
Well, one thing that's really annoying, just to the annoying things out of the way and you get some more interesting in a second, is one is the changing of the time, for one thing. So you have a situation that's particularly bad when it's in March, when the clocks go forward, that you get to sleep less, 1 hour less. And that has been linked to increased car crashes and also like heart attacks and stuff, which there's actually less of them when people sort of, as it were, get more sleep when the clocks go back, which in here in England is going to be on Sunday. And it gets reversed. So kind of going backward isn't quite as bad. But the alteration of the time is particularly annoying. It's really obvious, especially in schools or whatever, that the concentration levels when the clocks go forward in particular simply is terrible. Like people are way more tired. And as well, and also doesn't help with the fact that it's about night owls, that teens generally have a more of a later starting sort of chronotype. No, not owls as such, but they would naturally, quote unquote, want to sleep longer, sleep later and wake later. Whereas the teachers are old and therefore don't, at least in comparison. So a lot of it is kind of the changes. Also, I suppose I like the idea of the clock measuring the movement of the sun, because that seems to be more consistent with the general calendar, which is interesting because I think your points you've made so far, I mean, it does make sense as well to build the time around us and what our needs are. However, that does seem to be somewhat in tension with sort of like the measurement of calendars as such, which seem to be ways of sort of quote unquote objectively measuring time. Now, we could go into deep dive as what actually time is, because it's not immediately obvious what time actually is. But things like a year is a way of just trying to measure the flow of time. There's a sense of this passage of time, and we use the movement of the sun, or what looks like the movement of the sun, to determine that. Although other cultures have used the moon, and I believe that the Israelites in the Old Testament had a lunar calendar, but then had like an extra 13th month of an irregular length so that they could catch up to where the sun was. It was kind of like a hybrid sun and moon calendar, as it were. So I think that's an issue. So that thing is in tension, which I think is interesting. But I think also, I think really my critique, I suppose, is the idea that you have the time zones that you do currently have are just way too big to get this to work well. So there was an experiment in England to keep the UK on British summertime, which is an hour ahead of the sun, as it were. So the sun is at the highest point in the sky at 1 p.m. Between like the early 1970s. The thing is, in the south, that kind of worked quite well. But in the north, it just meant it was just massively dark in the morning for ages. And that was notable for me because I tried to get up early to go to the gym. And for the last like week or so, it's just been really dark to go. So I was looking forward to the clocks going back so that it was light when I actually went, because it's nicer to cycle in the light than it is in the dark. But yeah, the time zones that they do are just huge and are unnatural, but also don't really suit how people live as well. It would seem to me to make more sense to have far more time zones. And this is complicated and hard work, but I mean, you can cope when you go on holiday and you know you're dealing with people in a different time zone. And especially now with modern technology, and you can always check what the time is there. There's no reason why you couldn't do this. So, for instance, if it was the case that it was better in the south of England, actually, I don't think it is because I'm in the south, but you could have different time zones to better suit this. And I do think you're right. It does make sense to have the light when people are awake. That clearly makes sense. And when you have the light bulb, then that isn't just going to be, people aren't just going to be waking up when it is quote unquote natural, well, when it's naturally light, which is what you would expect in cultures without artificial light. So yeah, in everything else being equal, it seems to make sense that most activities are better in the light than they are in the dark. So you want to be able to have the most usable light. The question is, how can you achieve it? And also, you want to keep it on a consistent basis, because changing the clocks is a bad idea. Interestingly, according to DeepCKI, one of the first suggestions of sort of changing the clocks was actually a golfer called William Willett, who wrote a pamphlet called The Waste of Daylight in 1907. He actually suggested the clock should go forward every like an hour, but in 20-minute increments each week. But he was complaining that he was playing golf and his evening golf round got curtailed because it kind of got dark too soon. So he was complaining that he was playing golf and he couldn't continue his round because it was too dark. And that's like, why don't we just change the time around? So those are some sort of vague. And of course, this is obviously one reason to oppose summertime, is that it was brought in because of World War I. Apparently, the British copied the Austro-Hungarians in doing it, and also in World War II, we went to double British summertime, whereby we would the highest point of the sun, the highest point of the sky would have been at 2 p.m. as well. So that's another option. Yeah. So those are some overall, some general opening remarks.
Your point about it being so, one of the things that it bothers me about this debate is oftentimes people confuse the clock changes for the fact that days get shorter if you don't live on the equator. Days get shorter as the calendar progresses towards December 21st or whatever the shortest day of the year, and get vice versa. So the fact that it's getting darker in the morning would happen even if you had a perfectly natural, air quote, natural time. Days would just get shorter. That's my point about the 20-hour day for the Russian peasants and the 4-hour day. So even if the sun doesn't rise, if you only have a 6-hour day and the sun only rises at 9 a.m. or 9 a.m. I mean, this is like, the first time I realized it as a kid, we went up to Tobermory once in northern Ontario during the summer. I experienced, a 3 a.m. sunrise. I was sort of confused, but that's because it's just like north. That has nothing to do with daylight savings time. So a lot of that confusion, at the point out, is oftentimes what people are complaining about. And as far as the, adding an hour in the fall and subtracting an hour in the spring, I agree that the system is silly, but like the debate here in the United States always then breaks out where it's like, well, some people like summertime, other people like wintertime. And my point of all this previous information is like the arguments that the advocates of natural time make just seem kind of lame, in the sense that, like, I think it's a perfectly legitimate point for people to say that, I want the golfing example is awesome. I love that example. Now, the critics often say, well, why don't you organize your day in such a way that you have time to play golf then? And you can make that point, but then which is harder to do? It is a fairly easy hack once you have a standardized, centralized time, just to change the clocks. And your argument about digital clocks and having more time zones is true, but that's also true for changing the clocks too. Why not alternate between 25 and 23-hour days? Why not? I mean, this goes back to that's one reason I found that book about people's internal clocks. So I'm not a very habitualized person. Like, to me, a habit is only a happenstance thing. It's only things I might I've always been able to adjust my sleep fairly easily. But then again, I also can every once in a while sleep like 12 hours. And actually, since reading that book, sometimes I indulge in doing that. And it's awesome. But then also sometimes I can sleep for 3 hours and I only probably slept it's Monday morning here. I only slept probably 4 hours last night, but I'm completely wired. So even there, the thing about the changes, that's true. I mean, but then one of the reasons we stick with this system is there's two camps and no one can agree on it. And in the winter in the north, the days are just inherently shorter. So my question then becomes the who. Who should set the time or make the choice? I mean, this to me is like, you could say, well, this is like this mirrors our measurements and it exactly mirrors our measurement discussion. Because if I want, and it's interesting that there is a slight difference between the U.S. mile and the British mile. So if I said, not that London or England makes railroads anymore, things like maybe they do, but like if I wanted a 10-mile railroad built, and I think there's a slight difference between the British mile and the U.S. mile. I think should double check this before. There'd be a slight difference. Now, if you're just doing a general job, it's irrelevant. But if you're doing a precise job, which is something that would industrialized city do, it would matter. And if you multiplied that by 10,000, it would matter a lot. So so whether I like it or not, when I go to Canada, who runs on, or Europe, I have to use kilometers and meters. And like things like in the bike industry, or it's done a lot on meters too. And that's just the standardization. Because a lot of companies that started there were French, or at least or Japanese, and they both use the metric system. So it's like, unfortunately, I'm forced to use the metric system in those things. But I personally like the imperial system, but whether or not it exists is not a question that's in my hands. This mirrors our previous discussion over language and bureaucracy. So there is many societies do have a times and weights bureaucracy or measurement bureaucracy or something like that. So my question for you, Swatha, is who should make that choice? I don't have a good answer to that question. I mean, you could say a smaller society might make the choice better, but like you yourself, I mean, you have clients that have on many different time zones, and I don't want to read too much into your personal life, but you have homeschooled kids, which means you could actually have, if you really wanted to play social experiment, you could start your day at 4 a.m. or 4 p.m. if you really wanted to. I mean, if you can sort of envision a private microstate starting its day at all sorts of times. And in certain societies, they do start their day midday. It's a useful thing. I think that's something that are closest. But anyway, that's my point. What would you make? Who should set the time, or who should make that choice? What would you say that question, Swatha?
That's it's very difficult to say. I mean, who should set the time? I mean, I suppose that question only makes sense in industrialized circumstance because I don't know. Do you imagine you just used the sundial or the equivalent, or to go, well, it's morning now, so we do stuff. So, I mean, given an industrialized society, it would seem to be the case that some organization which had some sort of natural elite or some sort of non-governing sort of micro-statey sort of, we have some sort of organization or individual is going to have to decide what the time is. And because remember, all that really means is this is what we mean when it's 12, or this is what we mean when it's 10 or something. Then everyone else is free to change and act at whatever times they see fit. But it does seem to be the case that people coordinate their actions. Yeah, it's interesting. So interesting is sort of like, well, why? It seems to be the case that what people could do is they could change the time that they open. I mean, so for instance, some churches I went to in America, they had they opened at different times in the summer because it was mentally hot in the summer. So they started the church earlier rather than later in the winter. Because that's something they don't do here. I don't know if there's in America and other places where they just go, these are summer opening times, we open at this time, and the winter opening times, we open at this time. Because that's something you could clearly do, but people don't seem to want to do it. Possibly because they want to be open when everybody else is open. Is possible. And so if they chose to open at a different time, then it wouldn't really correlate with everybody else. But that'd be a kind of a relatively simple solution. So I need to look more into it, but it seems to be the case that in industrialized societies, people kind of want to be open at similar times, which is kind of facilitated by whatever quote unquote the official time is. But yeah, you're going to have some sort of organization or individual deciding, okay, this is what we mean by 12. Now, of course, I mean, you could just have everybody deciding that. I suppose that you can envisage a situation it doesn't, and just maybe probably the biggest and most relevant and powerful organizations, businesses, or non-profit organizations or whatever would decide this is the time we use, and everyone just copies it because, well, that's the time. So that's another option. I don't know if there's any examples of that happening. Maybe I'm not sure if that worked with railroads. I'm not sure on the exact history of that, but those are a couple of options.
In practice, the natural time advocates are also appealing to the time bureaucracy to change the time to their desired system, as opposed to the current existing system. And like, you're right in the sense that I would never dreamt of this system if it didn't get implemented. And I would oppose, I would have probably opposed it at the time, but this has been quote unquote natural for me. And I've always enjoyed, like, DST, the clock change always gives me a slight advantage over other people because, like, I have always been able to I need an alarm, for example, because, like, I can just sleep continuously. Um, uh, and that's another interesting thing. If you want to go into AI, what did people do before alarms existed? Well, many people just slept. And that goes back to my opening book about people's clocks being longer. So I might be a person who, if in terms of comparative advantage, benefits from this in that sort of race to the bottom sense. However, that withstanding, the the time zone, the fact that we change our clocks, to me, gives us an interesting point to discuss the clocks itself. And I the kind of precision that we modern people have, we do not have in the 1800s or the times before railroads. And this shows up in our language thing because we still have words like morning or noon. Like, I told you were gonna meet at such and such time. I didn't told you when the day would break. If I said the day would break, we would never align our times because we're thousands of miles apart. So in that sense, the time standardization facilitates this conversation in terms of, like, coordination. So in places like Russia, interesting enough, I think they're all on Moscow time. Same with China; they're all on Beijing time. Again, you might argue that's a more centralized society. In some ways, it is. In some ways, it isn't. So one of the ways in which the people who don't like the current existing system could do, and you sort of hinted at this, is just change locally, start changing what you do. Like public schools, some public schools start a little earlier, some public schools start a little later here in the United States. And don't get me wrong, I'm not a fan. Don't mistake me. Not a fan of the public school system. But businesses and other things who dislike this could just keep their hours the same. But then that goes into the coordination problem, which is like, this is like a benevolent, relatively benign and benevolent, relatively, problem of anarchism and authority and states. Because I don't think you get this kind of standardization potentially without centralized states, because most time zones were centralized around the capital city in the time zone and worked out from that way. And that's also probably true of the calendars in, like, Babylon and Sumeria and places like that too. So like the standardized time to some extent is a creature of the modern industrial state, as well as the pre-modern state too, to a lesser extent, but definitely the modern industrial state. But it's a relatively benign example, and I do think it facilitates things. But I don't see, even if we got anarchy, oddly enough, I think we'd end up adopting some private organization would probably adopt the time, and there's a potential that you could be in the same situation that you are in now. That private organization might just decide that it happens to like the time in this manner, and you don't. That could easily be the case. So just because you advocate for one system doesn't mean that you're guaranteed to get one general set of principles. Doesn't mean you're guaranteed to get that system. So, and what I think about the question more deeply, which I've done in the past week or two, thinking about this episode, I think there's all sorts of answers you can get on over what time you should do. And, like, one of the starting points I would make is, if I'm being rational, I would start the day in midday or like 9 a.m. in terms of the calendar. That would make, or 6 a.m. or something like that, rather than starting at midnight. That would be like a one weird quirk I would add if I became time dictator. But that withstanding, I do get your argument about the clock changes. However, I see the debate as between those who like sunlight in the evening, a little more sunlight in the evening versus a little more sunlight in the mornings. But it's confined by the natural length of days. We don't live on the equator where we have a perfect day length every day. It would be interesting if this would have happened if the 12-hour days remained the same. Like if England or northern United States had a 12-hour day, the same length every day, every year, whether this system would have even ever been implemented. Because that golfer during the summer who was golfing at 7 p.m. would be fine to golf 7 to 9 p.m. But in the winter, he would not be fine. So the varying length of natural daylight is a problem. And that's why the book I thought was interesting. Because what you'd really say is you sleep less. If it's better to sleep when it's dark out. Really, nature is a tyrannical thing, especially in outside of the equator, because you have more hours of day in the summer and fewer hours of day in the winter in terms of day length. It's if you mean day length as amount of time out there. So you sort of balked at the who question, but the who there is, if you let nature decide, you really are like, that's the real thing people are complaining against the fact that the days vary in daylight length. So then I'm running out of ideas here to talk about. If you have any final comments or long comments on this final point, I don't really have anything more to say. Thanks for doing this topic as usual.
I think you're right. I mean, the debate is currently constituted as those who want more light in the evening and more light in the morning. I think that's certainly true. I think that the stuff you've given me made me think about it more, and you really should be based around what people do. I just think that having the massive time zones as we currently do is not a good idea. If you were to be able to modify the time zones. Now, again, as I said, you could just change what time you did things, but it seems to be the case that people like to know what people in the area they're doing at a particular time in general, so they can coordinate what they do. Now, whether you could do it the other way, maybe it's just a collective action problem that so that it could be based around what people do, and then you could have this sort of agreeable time. It is a bit silly that you have the same time, say, in London as you do, say, in Northern Scotland, because Northern Scotland's daylight hours change massively more than London does. It's huge when it's up because it's like 1,000 miles, maybe something like that. Maybe not quite that. It's a long way. On the starting measuring during midday, that's interesting because I've always thought when it comes to the general calendar that actually having the new year starting in January doesn't make any sense at all. And really, if you're going on the natural thing, I would say what would make the most sense is to start the calendar, and the year should begin at the equinox on the 21st of March, because that's sort of the time where winter has passed and you're moving into spring, and spring seems to be the time of new and rebirth, and so it makes sense to start things in spring. Then you have the summer, the height of things when things are growing. Then you have sort of the time of aging in autumn, and then death in winter, which seems to follow human life cycles well and would fit nicely around the sun as well. It would also have the benefit of getting rid of annoying New Year celebrations, which mess up Christmas, which has always been a bugbear of mine. It's like, oh no, Christmas is over now, it's New Year. It's like, no, New Year is just a made-up thing. It doesn't mean anything. It just gets away with Christmas. So we could get rid of that and then put an actual thing that makes sense for New Year in the end of March. That's what I would do with the calendar. Oh, and also one of the peculiar thing when it comes to the calendar, there's with the years, or the day, sorry, there's the difference between a solar day and a sidereal day. I think, I can't remember how to pronounce that one. One is when the sun gets to the same point of the sky, and then there's the one where the Earth has rotated 360 degrees on its axis. The solar day is what everybody imagines as a day, which is 24 hours. And the sidereal day is, from memory, 23 hours, 56 minutes, and 4 seconds. I remember learning that a long time ago. So yeah, you have these lots of weirdnesses of these sort of constants which aren't really as sort of nice and precise as you would like. But yeah, the solution is more time zones. We even have these at the moment. I taught somebody in India, and I was saying, isn't the time this? Is like, no, it's like 4:30, not 4. Like, what? Why? It's like, oh, we're 4.5 hours ahead of you. So there's at least one existing time zone which is on a half hour. So if you can do that in one place, you can do it in more places. Obviously, there's going to be a trade-off, but the current situation of I'm like it all the way down like one segment of the earth is silly. With that, I'd now just like to thank everyone for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family and subscribe to us on Podbean and on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings and the more people can access this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason at all, please contact us at mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com.